Many of history's most notorious serial killers hid behind masks of respectability, working as doctors, businessmen, or community members to avoid suspicion while committing horrific crimes. This outward appearance of respectability allowed them to blend in, gain the trust of their victims, and avoid early suspicion from law enforcement. But, how can someone live an apparently ordinary life while hiding such horrific crimes? Some notable respectable serial killers are Ted Bundy, a charming law student and political volunteer who used his clean-cut appearance to lure victims who trusted him. Harold Shipman, a respected British general practitioner who murdered hundreds of his patients, earning him the moniker Dr. Death. John Wayne Gacy, operated as a successful construction contractor, active community volunteer, and political precinct captain to conceal a double life. Story 1. In 1987, Tunbridge Wells, Kent, was shaken by two separate murders. The victims were Wendy Knell, aged 25, and Caroline Pierce, aged 20. They did not know that their deaths would become part of one of Britain's most enduring unsolved murder investigations. Both women were sexually assaulted and strangled. Their deaths left their families devastated. But the person responsible was not identified. And investigators never completely abandoned the possibility that the killer could eventually be identified. But for Wendy and Caroline's families, the passage of time brought another painful reality. The killer was still free. And they still had no answers. For more than 3 decades, 2 murders remained unsolved. 2 young women had been killed in Kent in 1987. Their families were left without answers. There was no conviction. No explanation. And no clear idea of who had taken their lives. Years passed. Then decades. Technology changed. Forensic science developed. Then, more than 30 years later, investigators finally identified the man responsible. His name was David Fuller. David Fuller did not live the life people might imagine when they hear the word murderer. He worked. He had a job. He lived in the community. And eventually, he became employed as an electrical maintenance supervisor within the hospital system. The breakthrough came decades after the murders. Police revisited the evidence from the deaths of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to examine evidence in ways that had not been possible in 1987. Eventually, David Fuller came into focus. In December 2020, he was arrested and charged in connection with the murders. In 2021, he was convicted of the murders of Wendy Knell, 25, and Caroline Pierce, 20, whom he strangled and sexually assaulted after breaking into their homes, months apart in 1987, in Royal Tunbridge Wells, Kent, in what became known as the Bedsit murders. The killer's DNA had been known since a cold case review in 2007, and analysis of the samples in the 2 cases would later prove that the murders were committed by the same unidentified perpetrator. Fuller was eventually identified as the perpetrator in 2020 when a match was made between his DNA and the samples from the case. After more than 30 years, the families of Wendy and Caroline finally had a name. But the arrest was only the beginning. Because when investigators began examining Fuller and his background, they found evidence of another horrifying pattern. The investigation into the murders led police to Fuller's home. There, officers discovered extensive digital evidence. It revealed that Fuller had been secretly recording and documenting sexual offenses against deceased people. The investigation then expanded dramatically. Police began examining whether the victims could be identified and whether the offenses could be connected to hospitals where Fuller had worked. This became known as Operation Sandpiper. The scale was extraordinary. In a parliamentary statement in 2021, the government said investigators had found evidence relating to 100 victims, with 81 formally identified. At that stage the victims were women and girls. Their ages ranged from children to elderly women. And the offenses had taken place over many years. The discovery meant that investigators were no longer dealing with a single murderer. They were investigating a man who had apparently maintained a secret criminal life alongside his ordinary employment. Fuller pleaded guilty to the 2 murders and 44 charges relating to 78 females between 2008 and November 2020. On Wednesday he was sentenced to a further 4 years in prison after pleading guilty to sexually abusing the bodies of 23 more women aged between 45 and 92, 10 of whom have never been identified. They include 12 counts of sexual penetration of a corpse and 4 counts of possession of extreme pornography between 2007 and 2020. During the sentencing hearing at the Old Bailey, relatives of some of the victims expressed their anger and devastation. The daughter of a woman who was abused after her death spoke in court of her absolute disgust at Fuller's actions, describing him as a monster. She said her mother did not want to die in hospital and the family declined a post-mortem examination because she had been subjected to enough prodding and poking during her illness. On finding out about the abuse, she said, "The pain and emotional upset seared through my body like a knife. He took advantage of her helplessness and death where we were unable to protect her." Addressing the defendant in the dock, she said, "David, I want you to know how much damage you have caused, how your sick and twisted behavior has damaged families like mine. I'm pleased you are now being held accountable for what you did only 7 hours after she died." A father said he could not put into words how disturbing it was to find out what happened to his daughter at Fuller's hands. The brother of another victim said, "He has caused complete and utter devastation. David Fuller has tainted every single memory I have of my sister. All I can think of is what he did to my sister when she was supposed to be resting." In mitigation, Catherine Donnelly accepted that Fuller's offenses had caused profound harm to a significant number of people. In a televised sentencing, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb handed Fuller 4 more years custody, but added, "You will remain in prison until your death." Story 2. Harold Shipman was one of the deadliest serial killers in history, believed to have murdered about 250 of his patients, according to an official inquiry into his crimes. In 2000 he was convicted on 15 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. 4 years later he died by suicide. Shipman's murders raised troubling questions about the powers and responsibilities of the medical community in Britain and about the adequacy of procedures for certifying sudden death. Shipman was born into a working-class family in Manchester. A bright child, he became interested in medicine as he watched his mother receive morphine injections to ease the pain she suffered while dying of lung cancer. In 1966 Shipman married Primrose Oxtoby, and the couple later had 4 children. In 1970 Shipman received a medical degree from Leeds University, and a few years later he became a general practitioner in Todmorden in Lancashire. In 1975, after it was discovered that he had written several fraudulent prescriptions for the opiate pethidine, to which he had become addicted, he was forced out of his practice and into drug rehabilitation. In 1977 Shipman found work as a general practitioner in the town of Hyde in Greater Manchester, where eventually he gained respectability and developed a thriving practice. Over the years, several people raised concerns about the number of elderly people who died in his care. In April 1998 the police closed an investigation after searching for several months and finding insufficient evidence. 2 months later one of his patients, an 81-year-old woman, was discovered dead in her home only hours after Shipman visited her. Her family was perplexed by the suddenness of her death. She had appeared to be in good health, by the fact that her will had been changed to benefit Shipman. It bequeathed her entire estate, valued at some £400,000, to him. And by Shipman's insistence that no autopsy was necessary. The family went to the police, and an ensuing investigation uncovered 14 other suspicious deaths. It was determined that all of the deceased patients had received lethal doses of the painkiller diamorphine and that Shipman had signed a death certificate attributing the incident to natural causes. A government inquiry was ordered to determine how many more patients Shipman may have murdered. In 2005 an official report found that he had killed an estimated 250 people beginning in 1971. His motives were unclear. Some speculated that Shipman may have been seeking to avenge the death of his mother, while others suggested that he thought he was practicing euthanasia, removing from the population older people who might otherwise have become a burden to the healthcare system. A third possibility raised was that he derived pleasure from the knowledge that, as a doctor, he had the power of life or death over his patients and that killing was the means through which he expressed this power. Despite his forgery of the will of one of his victims, financial gain appears not to have been a serious motive. One key question that plagued investigators was how such a large number of deaths could have occurred without raising suspicions of foul play. This was all the more baffling because Shipman's patients were normally healthy shortly before their encounters with him. The fact that Shipman took advantage of his patients' trust in him as a doctor made his crimes particularly odious to the public. Story 3. Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998, and was found to own a Brother typewriter of the type used to make the forged will. Prescription for Murder, a 2000 book by journalists Brian Whittle and Jean Ritchie, suggested that Shipman forged the will either because he felt his life was out of control and wanted to be caught, or because he planned to retire at age 55 and leave the United Kingdom. Police investigated other deaths that Shipman had certified and investigated 15 specimen cases. They discovered a pattern of his administering lethal doses of diamorphine, signing patients' death certificates and then falsifying medical records to indicate that they had been in poor health. In addition, an abnormally large number of the deaths occurred around the same time of day, when Shipman was on his afternoon visits, and in the doctor's presence. In 2003, 3 years after Shipman had been convicted, a paper by statistician David Spiegelhalter and others found that Shipman's mortality rates had been broadly in line with national rates between 1988 and 1994, and started increasing in 1995. They suggested that statistical monitoring could have led to an alarm being raised at the end of 1996, although not before, when there had already been 67 excess deaths of Shipman's female patients aged over 65. Before reaching 119 in 1998, when suspicions were first actually raised. In 2005, it came to light that Shipman may have stolen jewelry from his victims. In 1998, police had seized over £10,000 worth of jewelry they found in his garage. In March 2005, when Primrose asked for its return, police wrote to the families of Shipman's victims asking them to identify the jewelry. Unidentified items were handed to the Assets Recovery Agency in May. The investigation ended in August. Authorities returned 66 pieces to Primrose and auctioned 33 pieces that she confirmed were not hers. Proceeds of the auction went to Tameside Victim Support. The only piece returned to a murdered patient's family was a platinum diamond ring, for which the family provided a photograph as proof of ownership. A memorial garden to Shipman's victims, called the Garden of Tranquility, opened in Hyde Park, Hyde, on July 30, 2005. As of early 2009, families of over 200 of the victims of Shipman were still seeking compensation for the loss of their relatives. The Shipman case, and a series of recommendations in the Shipman Inquiry Report, led to changes to standard medical procedures in the UK, now referred to as the Shipman Effect. Many doctors reported changes in their dispensing practices, and a reluctance to risk overprescribing pain medication may have led to underprescribing. Death certification practices were altered as well. The forms needed for a cremation in England and Wales have had their questions altered as a direct result of the Shipman case. For example, the persons organizing the funeral must answer, "Do you know or suspect that the death of the person who has died was violent or unnatural? Do you consider that there should be any further examination of the remains of the person who has died?" John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured and murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978 in Norwood Park Township, a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public performances as a clown prior to the discovery of his crimes. Gacy actively embedded himself in his Norwood Park Township community near Chicago, making it difficult for neighbors, local authorities, or victims' families to initially suspect him. Business ownership: he ran a remodeling and construction company, which gave him a steady stream of young male employees and laborers to target under the guise of offering work, civic and political engagement. He served as a local Democratic Party precinct captain and participated in community events, building social capital that conferred immediate trust. The clown persona: he frequently performed as Pogo the Clown at children's hospitals, block parties, and charity fundraisers, creating a public identity of benevolence that sharply contrasted with his crimes. Gacy's life and crimes are not only a chilling testament to the capacity for evil but also a complex case study in the intersection of psychological pathology, social manipulation, and violent behavior. His methods, his choice of victims, and his gruesome murders have raised questions about what drives individuals to commit such horrific acts. This paper delves into the background, motives, methods, and eventual capture of John Wayne Gacy, offering an in-depth analysis of his life and crimes. By examining the psychological and sociological factors that contributed to Gacy's violent actions, this study aims to shed light on the disturbing nature of his crimes and the broader implications for understanding serial killers. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Gacy. His early life was shaped by significant challenges within his family environment. Gacy's father, an alcoholic, had a strained relationship with him, often making critical remarks about his son. These early experiences, marked by criticism and a lack of emotional support, had a lasting impact on Gacy's self-esteem and personal development. His mother, though not abusive, was often distant, and Gacy felt isolated and unsupported during his formative years. As a child, Gacy faced difficulties with social integration, experiencing bullying at school due to his weight and social awkwardness. His strained relationship with his father and feelings of isolation at home contributed to his sense of alienation. He later reflected that these experiences, combined with a lack of social acceptance, played a role in shaping his personal struggles. At 18, Gacy moved out of his family home, seeking independence and starting a career in various fields. He eventually returned to Chicago, where he became involved in the construction business and gained a reputation as a successful and well-liked member of his community. Gacy also became active in local politics, where he was able to establish connections with influential people. At times, he even participated in community events, where he portrayed a friendly and charitable persona. This public image would contrast sharply with his private life. While outwardly appearing successful, Gacy faced internal struggles, and he would later express that he had experienced a range of personal difficulties and frustrations. In the early 1970s, these struggles contributed to disturbing behaviors, and he began to commit a series of violent crimes that went unnoticed for a time. His ability to blend in with society and maintain his public persona allowed him to conceal his darker tendencies for several years before law enforcement connected him to a series of crimes. John Wayne Gacy's motives for committing his horrific crimes appear to be rooted in a complex mix of psychological issues, including a desire for power, control, and dominance, as well as deeply ingrained sexual compulsions. These factors, combined with his troubled upbringing, played a significant role in shaping his behavior. A primary motive behind Gacy's murders was his need for control. Throughout his life, Gacy struggled with a sense of powerlessness, especially in his early years. His father was often verbally abusive, which may have instilled a deep sense of inadequacy in Gacy. As he matured, he began to seek power and control over others, using his victims as a means to assert dominance. Gacy's manipulation tactics, which included luring his victims under the pretense of offering them jobs or assistance, reflect his need to feel superior. Many of his victims were young men and boys who were vulnerable and trusting, and Gacy preyed on these qualities, exploiting them for his own gain. In addition to his need for control, Gacy's actions were also sexually motivated. He often sexually assaulted his victims before killing them, suggesting that his violent acts were tied to his sexual fantasies. His behavior was not just about physical violence, but also about asserting sexual dominance over his victims, making them feel completely helpless. Gacy's later statements and interviews revealed that he saw his victims as objects for his sexual gratification and control. His violence was also closely linked to sadistic tendencies, where he took pleasure in inflicting pain and fear upon others. Gacy often played on the vulnerabilities of his victims, using his charm and authority to convince them to trust him. He also maintained a public persona as a respected member of the community, hosting parties and engaging in charity work, often as Pogo the Clown, a persona he created for children's parties. This mask of respectability made it easier for him to lure his victims without arousing suspicion, as no one would expect such a well-liked, seemingly harmless man to be capable of murder. John Wayne Gacy's capture in December 1978 was the result of a combination of investigative persistence and a series of critical mistakes on Gacy's part. His downfall began when 15-year-old Robert Piest went missing on December 11, 1978. Piest, a teenager working at a pharmacy, had plans to meet with Gacy regarding a potential job. Piest's mother became concerned when he didn't return home, and the authorities were quickly alerted. Gacy's name came up when police learned that Piest had been last seen with him. The investigation into Piest's disappearance led detectives to Gacy's house, where they initially conducted a search. At first, Gacy was cooperative, but his behavior quickly became suspicious. When questioned about Piest, Gacy claimed that the teenager had left his house and had simply disappeared. However, inconsistencies in his story and Piest's absence without a trace raised alarms. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more disturbing facts about Gacy's life. It became evident that he had a history of luring young men to his home with promises of work, money, or simply under the pretense of performing magic tricks. Witnesses came forward, reporting similar encounters with Gacy and recounting stories of young men who had gone missing under circumstances involving him. Upon further investigation, Gacy was linked to several other disappearances of young men over the past few years, and police obtained a warrant to search his property. The search led to the horrifying discovery of human remains buried under Gacy's house and in the nearby crawl space. A total of 29 victims were discovered at the property, and more remains were found at other locations, bringing the total to 33 confirmed victims. In addition to the remains found in his home, investigators also found personal belongings and evidence, including photographs of his victims and receipts linking Gacy to items belonging to the missing young men. Gacy's capture was sealed when he was confronted with the overwhelming evidence and eventually confessed to the murders, detailing the horrific nature of his crimes. Gacy typically targeted young men, many of whom were vulnerable, such as runaways, young workers, or those in need of money. He often lured them with offers of employment or money, such as promising jobs for manual labor or even sexual favors in exchange for money. Gacy's ability to mask his true intentions behind these seemingly harmless offers made it easy for him to gain the trust of his victims. He also frequently targeted individuals in the local gay community, appealing to their sense of need and desperation. Once Gacy had gained the trust of his victims and invited them into his home, he would perform what he referred to as the handcuff trick. He would handcuff them, claiming it was part of a magic trick or joke, only to use the handcuffs to restrain them. After they were trapped, the victims were unable to escape, allowing Gacy complete control. This method allowed him to manipulate and overpower his victims with ease, and it was a repeated technique that ensured his domination. After restraining the victims, Gacy would sexually assault them. He preferred to strangle his victims, often with a rope or by manually strangling them. This method allowed him to control the situation and prolong the victim's suffering, a process he seemed to derive a sadistic pleasure from. Strangulation was chosen because it was quiet, controlled, and efficient, allowing Gacy to avoid drawing attention during the murders. Gacy was meticulous in disposing of his victims' bodies. After killing them, he often buried their remains in the crawlspace of his house. This provided an effective hiding place for the bodies, as it was difficult to detect. He also disposed of several victims in nearby rivers, further distancing the evidence from his home. Gacy's careful disposal methods helped him evade law enforcement for a long period, as the bodies were hidden. Another key factor contributing to Gacy's motives was a desire for secrecy and hiding his true nature. Throughout his life, he worked hard to present himself as a respectable member of his community, even earning the nickname the Killer Clown due to his dual life as a community member and a serial killer. His need to keep his crimes hidden was part of a larger psychological mechanism where Gacy wanted to feel untouchable, shielded from any scrutiny. This secrecy allowed him to continue his crimes unchecked for years, as he maintained a facade of normalcy while committing brutal acts in private. Finally, Gacy's inability to form healthy, emotional connections with others played a crucial role in his motives. He struggled with his own identity and sexuality, and his relationships with others were often superficial. This emotional disconnect may have contributed to his inability to empathize with his victims, seeing them not as human beings but as mere tools to satisfy his desires. His murders can, in part, be seen as an attempt to fulfill his need for domination and to satisfy his deeply disturbing fantasies about control, power, and sexual submission. In summary, Gacy's motives were driven by a combination of psychological trauma, a desire for control and power, sadistic sexual urges, and a need to maintain his public persona. These factors all contributed to his ability to commit his crimes for years without being caught. John Wayne Gacy's methods were marked by a disturbing blend of manipulation, control, and calculated violence. Gacy was able to maintain his facade of being a respectable community member while engaging in the brutal murder of young men and teenage boys. His approach was methodical, allowing him to carry out his crimes with chilling efficiency for several years before being caught. On March 12, 1980, after deliberating for only a few hours, the jury found Gacy guilty of all 33 murders. The case was a chilling reminder of how a man could maintain such a normal public facade while harboring a sadistic and violent nature in private. The jury's decision was swift, and Gacy was sentenced to death by lethal injection. During the sentencing, the families of the victims delivered emotional statements, expressing their grief and outrage at the monstrous acts Gacy had committed. Gacy's defense team filed multiple appeals over the years, arguing that he had not received a fair trial. However, these appeals were rejected, and Gacy remained on death row at the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. He spent 14 years on death row before being executed on May 10, 1994. Gacy's execution marked the end of a reign of terror that had lasted more than 5 years. His death, like Dahmer's, was met with a sense of justice for the victims and their families, although the psychological impact of his crimes continues to be felt in discussions of criminal behavior and forensic psychology. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, and charged with the murders of 33 young men and boys. His capture and the gruesome discoveries at his home shocked the nation, revealing a sadistic killer living a double life as a respected local businessman. His arrest marked the end of his gruesome killing spree, but the revelations surrounding his crimes left an indelible mark on criminal history. John Wayne Gacy's trial was a highly publicized event, drawing nationwide attention due to the horrific nature of his crimes and his seemingly inconspicuous public persona. Arrested in December 1978, Gacy was charged with the murders of 33 young men and boys, although the exact number of victims remains uncertain, with some estimates suggesting even more. Gacy's trial began in February 1980, and his defense strategy revolved around his claim of insanity, arguing that he was not in control of his actions and suffering from multiple personality disorder, later referred